All right. Welcome, everybody, to Finance Essentials with Danny Hudson. I am your host, Danny Hudson, and welcome to this beautiful Wednesday. We're here in sunny Nashville. Hopefully, the weather's nice wherever you are. And I think I saw some people were getting snow last week. So I mean, if that's your thing in April, hey, good for you, good for you. But yeah, welcome everybody. I'm really excited for this week's show. We're gonna learn some things. I know I learned some things. A lot of it was unfortunately a bit anger inducing, but hey, you know what? That's the way it goes. But so to start off with, we got a little bit of housekeeping, right? Make sure you follow us on social media. We're on all the platforms. I'll have the links and stuff there, so that way you guys can follow. One of the things though that I did notice that Mr. Reed Coverdale, I don't know if you guys are familiar with who he is, but he made a post on Twitter. I think it was a couple of days ago, might have been yesterday. But one of the things that he mentioned was you don't get to know a person by what they post on Twitter. You get to know a person by following them on YouTube or something like that. I probably butchered it a little bit, but it makes a lot of sense. So hop over to YouTube, subscribe, watch the show over there, listen to it wherever you happen to be listening to podcasts. I did discover the other day that if you say, well, I guess I can't say it. If you say A's name, play Finance Essentials podcast, that she will actually play the podcast. I guess she syncs up with Apple or iTunes or whatever. I just can't say her name because if I do, she'll start playing it in the background and then I have to turn it off. But I did discover that it will actually play it. So if you want to listen to my beautiful voice in the comfort of your own home, just say that and she'll start playing the podcast, which is pretty cool. Another thing that came up that I want to get out of the way. I had a couple of people ask me on the last couple of shows I mentioned as far as no longer advertising or marketing on social media platforms. And they were basically suggesting that, just come out and say it and say why. It's basically for two reasons. One is I don't really support those platforms as far as kind of what they stand for, the control that they're kind of collecting, and as we talk about on this show, right, the biggest thing that you can do in a free market is support or not support businesses with your dollars. And so since I don't support them, I don't understand why I would give them money. The other one is, and this is for Facebook primarily, is that they reject a lot of times the marketing that I try to do for the show. The show that was on student loans was rejected. I had to change some things on that. The one about minimum wage was rejected. The one that I did with Larry Sharp was rejected. I've had a handful of shows that I did that were actually rejected for whatever various arbitrary rules or that kind of thing. And so it's just not worth it for me to change how I want to describe the show and how I want to, title things. And it's just not worth it for me to change how I want to do it, so that way it's okay with their platform. So I just decided, you know what, I'm not going to do it anymore. So there you go. That's the way it's going to go. But yeah, so on today's show, I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about Eric July's favorite topic. If you don't know who Eric July is, you should definitely follow him on Twitter. He's hilarious. But we're going to talk about Eric July's favorite topic, which is roads, right? Infrastructure is all over the news. It's all over social media in terms of people's thoughts. And why not? What's another $2.5 trillion, right? I mean, we've been printing it up like it's nobody's business. Why not throw another $2.5 trillion in there? And so the thought is that we are going to have this new quote unquote infrastructure plan that's going to be called the American Jobs Plan, right? Because American jobs is very important to the Biden administration. And one of the things that I learned today is that Kirsten Gillibrand, who is a senator, has redefined what infrastructure is. And so I learned today that apparently childcare is part of infrastructure. I learned that basically, if think about something that you think is important and that a ton of money should be spent on it, chances are she will agree. She will agree with you that that is infrastructure. And so, if you happen to be of that mindset where you believe that, caring for somebody over here, or in whatever group that's going to lobby and pay them the most money is considered infrastructure. And if you believe that childcare is infrastructure, and if you believe that remodeling schools is infrastructure, and if you believe that R&D into whatever various industries is infrastructure, then this might not be your episode. It might be a good idea for you to just go ahead and turn this one off, because we're not going to play that. That's not the way infrastructure is defined, in my opinion. And if you disagree with that, then today's show is probably not going to be too exciting for you. But the first thing that I wanted to do was go into a little bit of detail as far as what this is, right? So this is about a 2.2, which is on the underside. If you follow with Cato or the Committee for Responsible Federal Budgets, they're basically saying it's going to be over $2.5 trillion, 2.7, 2.6, whatever. But hey, what's a half $1 trillion, right? Between friends, why not throw another $500 billion at it? 2.2 doesn't sound too good. Maybe 2.75 sounds better. Either way, it is an incalculable amount of your money, right? That is going to be used. Well, I take that back. It won't be your money. This will be money that will be printed, and then it will be just added on to the debt, and then we'll just inflate it away. That's most likely what will happen. But so it's about a $2.2 trillion plan. And the goal of this plan, according to the Biden administration, is to reshape the American economy and make the most significant domestic U.S. investments in generations, right? Whoa, how great does that sound? Well, if you believe it, that sounds great. And how are they going to pay for it? Well, we already talked about how they're really going to pay for it, which is inflation. They'll print it and then they'll just kind of inflate it away and they'll add it to the debt. What they're claiming is that they will increase the corporate taxes. I think I actually read earlier today that they believe that increasing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28% will raise 2.1 trillion over the span of 14 years or whatever. What I read I read a statistic that basically said that if we raise it from 21 to 25%, it goes up about $500 million. So I'm just going to use 800 billion as the number. Now, the assumption there is that these companies who you're taxing will not restructure their companies to account for this adjustment in the corporate tax rate, which is nonsense, right? We already know that these companies who they anticipate that's going to fit this burden, that's going to foot this bill, are going to restructure. Now, and I'll save this for a different episode, but of course, Miss Janet Yellen has already basically said the U.S. is going to attempt to bully a bunch of other countries into setting a minimum corporate tax rate to prevent companies from leaving and headquartering their business in another country. We'll go into some details on that another time, but that's kind of their plan, right? Because they're like, well, we'll jack these rates up, and we just don't want companies to leave. We don't want there to be another place that they can go to that's actually more affordable. So we're just going to make everybody else bring their numbers up. So 2.2 trillion, but we got to be thinking, hey, we're going to dump $2.5 trillion into the infrastructure of this country, right? That's gotta do something for us, right? Well, if you listen to Mr. Joe Biden, it is going to do something. According to Joe Biden, it's going to create 19 million jobs. What? That sounds pretty great, right? 19 million jobs. And so that was kind of the narrative where they're pushing out there and they're saying, 19 million jobs going to be created, so on and so forth. How great does that sound? Well, it turns out, and Pete Buttigieg was actually called out on this. And man, Mayor Pete, I swear he gets called out on all kinds of stuff. He made a statement that talked about how the infrastructure plan is actually going to pay for itself, right? Which we always hear government officials talking about how it's going to pay for itself. And then in 16 years, it's actually going to start paying down on the deficit, right? Which, of course, we know the reason why they plan stuff for 10, 15, 16 years out is because that way they can say in 15 years from now, they go, well, we didn't plan that they were going to do X, Y, and Z based off of our assumptions at the time. It's nonsense. And so we already know in 15 years it's not going to pay for itself. We know in 2 years it's not going to pay for himself. And so, of course, he kind of got called out. He got called out on that. But he also got called out on the 19 million jobs as well. As it turns out, the baseline assumption of employment increase was actually already at about 16.3 million jobs. So the 19 million jobs is essentially total jobs created. And then the infrastructure plan, the jobs plan is the delta, right, between the 16.3 and the 19 million. So we're basically talking about that this jobs plan would essentially create 2.7 million jobs. Now, not as good as 19 million, but you're probably thinking, all right, Danny, come on, 2.7 million jobs? That's not too bad, right? But let's look at it on a cost basis. You're talking about $2.5 trillion. I think even just using the $2.2 trillion. If you spread that out over 2.7 million jobs, you're talking about $833,000 per job. Per job. So it is going to cost taxpayers $833,000 per job that will be created off of this American Jobs Plan. Now, again, if you've been tuning into the show, we've talked about this in the past. The way these numbers work is that they overinflate the positive numbers and then they underrepresent the negative numbers. So it's almost certain that you can bet that the plan will cost more than $2.2 trillion. It will. They will not raise the funds that they anticipate with the corporate taxes, and then they are overestimating the number of jobs that it will create. Because as you're going to find out when we go into this a little bit more, most of these aren't creating new jobs. What it's doing is it's shifting money around. Well, I guess it's not even shifting money around. It's basically coming up with money out of thin air, and then they're going to allocate that money off to whoever happens to have the best lobbyists, right? And so I would be very shocked if they got close to $2.7 million or 2.7 million jobs. But again, right, that's taxpayers. So think about the amount of taxes that you pay and how many of you it would take to pay for one of these jobs, $833,000, which is absolutely insane. So my head, right, when we're talking about finance and we're talking about costs, and we're talking about those kinds of things, I tend to think, well, why is infrastructure so expensive and why does it take so long? I'm sure if you're listening, you can probably think of a half dozen construction projects and that kind of thing off the top of your head, that have been working on for 10 years, 5 years, whatever it might be. And it seems like they're never actually making any progress. Well, the truth is they're probably not. But another thing, though, too, is that when certain aspects of infrastructure and how I define infrastructure, which is essentially, roads, bridges, highways, subways, trains, all that kind of thing is kind of how I define infrastructure, that the material costs have remained pretty consistently flat. And wages, as I'm sure most people would not really contest, is that wages for the most part really haven't raised up as well. I would have thought that those would have been some of the major drivers in terms of the increases in infrastructure costs. But as it turns out, as I was doing some research on this, it's actually not. And I don't know why The real answer wasn't my default answer because it tends to be my default answer. And what it is, it's essentially government red tape. I don't know why I didn't default to that, but essentially it boils down to government red tape and restrictions and that kind of thing, which drives up the cost. A perfect microcosm of this is New York City. I know New York City tends to be on the high side as far as costs, right? Because everything in New York City costs way too much because there's way too much red tape. But infrastructure costs in New York City is approximately 3 times what it is in Paris. And I saw a perfect example of this, and they were looking at building out a subway out to Second Avenue. Now, I'm not super familiar with the geography of New York City, but I guess apparently part of the long-term planning as far as the subway was a subway route that ran to or through Second Avenue. Well, apparently it passed like 100 years ago, and they have just now or recently actually got some of the construction done. So it took 100 years to kind of half-ass partial construction of subway infrastructure in New York City. And again, a lot of this is due to restrictions. And so there was a study that was actually done back in, I think it was in 2019. And what they were able to trace this back to was in the 1970s that there was an act that was passed that was called the National Environmental Policy Act. And if you're listening and you live in California, you're much more familiar with how this works, right? It's a lot more close to kind of NIMBYism, which is like not in my backyard. And what it requires of a lot of these construction projects is they have to do environmental studies, right? What is going to be the impact on the wildlife? What's going to be the impact on the perks of being around in that area? What it boils down to is people with money, they have a say in what's going on. They call it like the citizen voice, right? So if you have money and you have influence, you can basically say, oh, you guys want to build an interstate or a highway within so-and-so distance of my home? Yeah, I don't think so. We're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead and have issues with this, and we're going to raise cases and studies, and we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, because I like my quiet house. I like my view. I like this. I like that. And it slows everything down. It costs, more money to be able to complete this. And I didn't really realize that as much at a national level as much as I did with California, but it makes sense in the standpoint of we see it all the time in California. You could own your property. There was a guy who owned a restaurant in California. I believe it was in San Francisco. He owned a restaurant. He wanted to retire and sell it, but the neighbors, I think he was selling it to a housing developer that was going to put, some condos or something like that was on there. And that was his retirement plan, was selling this restaurant. Well, the neighborhood were basically saying, you can't do that. It's a historical landmark. And he's like, what are you talking about? This is my restaurant. You can't tell me I can't sell it. And so they actually protested to try to get his restaurant deemed a historical landmark. So he couldn't even sell his own restaurant. And so when you think about it kind of in terms like that, it does kind of make sense, on a national scale. Now, obviously, that's a bit of an extreme example, but I think another situation would be if you are in Seattle and you're very familiar with Mercer Island. If you are flying in and out of SeaTac, the SeaTac airport there, your route and your plane will not fly over Mercer Island, because guess where a lot of wealthy people live, and they don't want planes flying over their house. So they actually lobbied and had them shift the the landing trajectory or descent routes or whatever you want to call it to have to go around Mercer Island. And so that's one of the biggest factors that really drove up constructing costs. I'm sure Some of you guys have probably seen YouTube videos, right, where Japan, a typhoon comes through, wipes out a bridge, and you're like, oh my God, what are they going to do? And then you see that Japan rebuilds the bridge in like a week. Well, sorry, that's not the way it works here. You need permits, and you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you're lucky if you get a new bridge within 9 months, let alone a week. And so that was to kind of help provide a bit of insight on infrastructure, the history of infrastructure, the history of those types of costs, and a little bit of an idea in terms of, in my opinion anyway, kind of what infrastructure is. And so really what I wanted to do after that is let's get to the meat and potatoes of this, right? I mean, we're talking about $2.5 trillion. And they're not even calling it the infrastructure plan, right? They're calling it like the jobs plan. And so, well, what does that mean? That must mean that 2.5 million jobs are going into infrastructure, right? Well, if you're a listener of this show, you would already know the answer to that. And the answer to that is a big fat no. So let's see. USA Today actually did a pretty good breakout as far as this, and I'm just going to call it 2.5 trillion. There's no way it's going to come if they estimate 2.2. It's not coming in at 2.2. We know it's going to be higher. So I'm just going to refer to it as 2.5 trillion. So what they do is they break down everything into 4 categories, right? They break it into transportation, which was $620 billion. They break it into quality of life at home, which was $650 billion. They break it into for caregivers or for caregivers for the elderly and the disabled, which is $400 billion. And then they do $300 billion for R&D and manufacturing. So I'm going to save the transportation part for last, mainly because that's the part that I generally tend to associate with infrastructure. And so it's pretty interesting. That's only, less than 25%, but that's okay, right? Because, we're talking about $600 billion, right? That's going to be allocated to rebuild roads and bridges, right? Well, I don't know. We'll have to see. So we'll start at the bottom. So research and development and manufacturing. They allotted $52 billion for domestic manufacturers supporting rural and clean energy, $50 billion for a new office to monitor industrial capacity, $50 billion for the National Science Foundation for New Technology, $50 billion for the American Workforce Development and Worker Protection, $46 billion for quote-unquote support clean energy manufacturing, and a $40 billion for dislocated workers program. So that's the bulk of this $300 billion for research and development and manufacturing. Now, one of the things that I did not say one time in here was infrastructure. All of this is devoted to R&D and manufacturing towards, essentially Joe Biden at this point has kind of really pushed this protectionist industry where, we're going to buy everything American and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And so their plan is to kind of restructure everything in terms of the economy. Now, I'm not going to go down the conspiratorial route, but I do believe that there is a lot in here that is related to kind of quote unquote the new Green Deal, right? Or no, the Green New Deal, where they literally wanted to take over and shift where the economy was based. And I think this has a lot to do with that, with things like domestic manufacturing, supporting rural and clean energy. I mean, $52 billion for domestic manufacturing support that we're supporting rural and clean energy. Now, what this says to me, and what this screams to me, and we'll get to another part of this later when we're talking about electric vehicles, is subsidies, right? This is screaming to me, all of these clean energy companies, how can we lobby the government to get a piece of this jobs plan? Well, you know how they're going to get it. They're going to take them out to fancy dinners, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that, right? And that's how they're going to get these contracts. Now, what they're going to probably do is they're going to promise, well, we're going to hire 30,000 employees, and they're gonna be an average salary of this, and they're gonna be an average salary of that. And we know when you talk about like Foxconn in Wisconsin, and there are other examples as well, that it's not gonna come to fruition. And so we know that when we're talking about supporting rural and clean energy, that these are basically subsidies, right? They're gonna subsidize companies who most likely could not compete in a free market, and they are gonna subsidize them with billions of dollars of revenue. The other ones that really stood out for me is the new Office to Monitor Industrial Capacity and the National Science Foundation for New Technology. Now that's $100 billion on what? On what? Bureaucracy? I mean, what is a new office to monitor industrial capacity, and why do they need $50 billion to do it? And then the National Science Foundation for New Technology, is that screaming out that new technology is not being invented? Like, we're not coming up with new technology, that we need tens of billions of dollars of government subsidized money to come up with new inventions? And again, what that screams to me is that they're going to have government contracts that are going to go out, and they're going to be like, oh my God, I have this great idea, and then nothing is going to come from it, but the people at the top are going to make millions or maybe billions, who knows? But those two to me basically said, hey, look, we're not going to do anything with this money. It's not going to go anywhere. But now guess what we have, right? Now we have a permanent government agency that is going to exist for perpetuity with these goals. So now I don't know what their annual budgets are going to be. Let's just say they're small, right? We'll say it's $5 to $10 billion of annual costs, and so right now they're paying for 5 to 10 years. Well, two problems with that. One, it never goes away, right? So it's going to have to be renewed. And then two, it's not going to get smaller. It's only going to go up. So if that $50 billion right now is currently planned to cover 5 years, so say it's $10 billion a year, it's almost guaranteed that by the end of those 5 years, now their annual budget's $14 billion or $15 billion or, whatever that number might be. So those were two of the ones that really stood out for me. The next one is $400 billion for caregivers for elderly and disabled. Now, this one is super vague. I mean, I was not even really able to find out specific details on what exactly this means. It talks about being able to give raises to people who look after and care for the elderly and the disabled. And don't get me wrong, as a person who is a very big proponent of taking care of community and building up community and really using our resources and our means to help take care of those that are less fortunate than us, I believe that is an absolute paramount obligation that we have as a people and as of a society. But I don't know what this means. I don't know what this $400 billion means. One of the things that they did say was it was talking about expanding a Medicaid program and eliminates backlog that prevents thousands from getting care. Now, again, I work in finance, so I understand numbers pretty well. $400 billion does not equate to thousands getting care. $400 billion and thousands getting care absolutely astounds me. I mean, I think that is absolutely crazy. So I don't know what this $400 billion it actually means. The next one is the quality of life at home. So keep in mind, this was $650 billion. So it's over $200 billion to retrofit homes and buildings. $200 billion. Now, who gets that, right? Who is going to get that money? I can tell you who I think is going to get it. I think it's going to be companies who spring up that they say, well, we are going to go in and we're going to retrofit, lower income, working class neighborhoods who they don't have the ability to be able to pay for repairs and upgrades and that kind of thing for their own. And the government's going to go, genius, here's $100 billion, right? My guess is there's going to be very little oversight. I know we talked about it before with the PPP, where basically if you requested a PPP loan that was under $20 million, they're like, we don't even care. And so I would be surprised if there were not a ton of companies who are going after this money, claiming that that's what they're going to do, right? They're going to spend this money on helping out, and they might repair a house or two, or they might fix up a house or two, or something along those lines. And there may even be some good companies that end up getting in there and doing it. But the truth is that there's going to be tons of waste, and there's going to be tons of stuff that doesn't get done. And at the end of the day, in a decade from now, a lot of these people that live in these really crappy situations are unfortunately still going to be living in really crappy situations, because all the people who are getting these bids are just going to make off with the money. Another one is $111 billion for water. It eliminates all lead pipes, and it modernizes drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater. So basically at this point now, they're talking about repairing and fixing anything that has to do with water. Again, I think what's going to happen there is you're going to have a lot of cities and states and counties that are going to go, uh-oh, our system needs fixing. Come on in, federal government. Let's see what we can do. And then the politically connected, again, are going to get these contracts, and then they're going to make out in the end. And somewhere like Flint may still not have drinkable water. Or if they do, it's going to cost tens of billions of dollars to get them drinkable water. The next one is $100 billion to expand broadband. And what that means is, that means now that it is going to be a government broadband, right? The federal government or a government agency or a government subsidiary is probably going to be operating a broadband company, or at least monitoring it or overseeing it, or something along those lines. This one really drove me nuts. $100 billion to upgrade and build public schools. Now, if you have been listening to the show, then you already know, and you can always go back if you'd like to. I recommend it because, why wouldn't you want to go back and listen to more shows with me? They've already gotten like $200 billion. They've already gotten like $200 billion, and they've spent like $4 billion. Now, to be fair, the union pensions and stuff got saved with almost half of that. What was it, $89 billion to save? So their piggy bank's gotten down there to, about $100 billion or so. But why do they need another $100 billion to upgrade and build public schools? It's crazy to me. That's just nuts. And then the other two are $40 billion for public housing projects, and then $27 billion for clean energy and sustainability accelerator. Now, the housing projects, that's going to be one where most people listening are probably going to say, well, that makes sense, right? Because a lot of times these housing projects, the quality of the homes are terrible. The living arrangements are not good. Maybe there's mold, or the ACs don't work. I don't think anybody would really contest that point. The part that I do think that people would contest is do we really believe that $40 billion is going to help make those sustainable? Because the answer is no. What's going to happen is they're going to spend $40 billion. They're going to slap some new coats of paint here and there. They might build an extra building or two or something along those lines. But it's going to be $40 billion of money that's going to get pocketed by well-connected guys who have connections and who lobby well. I mean, that's where that money is going to go. If you're noticing a trend and all of these topics, I'm basically laying out who is going to be making out in this deal. And guess what? It's not you, and it's not me. So the last piece, now keep in mind, we're down to about $600 billion of this $2.5 trillion plan. And again, one thing that we have not talked about yet is what I consider infrastructure. So the pieces of this one are broken out into three primary areas, which is $174 billion on electric vehicle stations, bus fleets, and tax incentives and rebates for electric vehicles. So the EV part of it, right, as we're trying to structure this new economy to go more carbon neutral, we're talking about tax incentives and rebates for electric vehicles. Well, guess who's not buying electric vehicles? People who can't afford an electric vehicle, right? So all of this other stuff we're talking about, we need to build up, the poorer communities or whatever. They're not buying electric vehicles. Guess what you're doing? You're subsidizing people who could afford an electric vehicle. Now, what you might be thinking is, you're like, yeah, but we need to push people in that direction to have demand there so more companies start to build these electric vehicles. And point taken. But at the same time, you can't subsidize something if it's not valuable, if it's not profitable. That's one of the things that Tesla ended up doing, where they were really able to gain a lot of popularity because of tax incentives and tax rebates that people were able to get on their vehicles. Now, electric vehicles might come, but guess what? Guess where lithium comes from? Lithium comes from places like the Congo. I mean, there's basically like wars going on and people are dying to try to get this lithium. And guess what? They're not easy to dispose of. And so all of this thought that if we just switch over to EVs and get the energy and stuff cleaned up, that there's no problems or there's no drawbacks. There's always going to be a drawback when it comes to this kind of thing until we live in, Star Trek, where scarcity no longer exists. And so that one was really big. And also too, when it talks about EV charging stations, guess who's going to get the contracts for those? Whoever lobbies and has the connections in government. So basically this is a situation where the government is going to be choosing the winners and the losers in the electric vehicle and the electric industry, chase. Another one is 50 or 85 billion for modernizing the transit system and $80 billion for Amtrak. $80 billion for Amtrak. Now they are going to be expanding routes and they're going to be making repairs and so on and so forth. Amtrak has lost money every year since 1971. 50 years in a row of Amtrak losing money. And they are going to throw $80 billion at Amtrak. And guess what? They're not going to get a lot of return. They're not going to get a lot of return on investment for that money. It's just not going to happen. People in America don't like trains. People here just don't really ride trains. And it's not cheap. Amtrak isn't necessarily that much cheaper. And it doesn't really get you to where a lot of people want to go. And so they just don't do it. They just take cars. Now, you might be saying, and it's a valid point, well, I've been to Europe, or I've been to Asia, or I've been to wherever, and I rode the bullet train, and it was awesome, and it was beautiful, and it was so on and so forth. I'm not even disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is that our current train infrastructure, especially Amtrak, is not that. It will not succeed. This is $80 billion of wasted money. Amtrak won't turn a profit. They won't do it. It will continue to lose money. And so that one really made me go crazy. And so what that brings us to kind of conclude on this is $115 billion on roads and bridges. Right? We finally, at the end of the show, we get to the roads and bridges, and it's $115 billion. So approximately 6%, 5 to 6% of this total quote unquote infrastructure bill is actually going to be devoted to roads and bridges. They're going to clean up and repair about 20,000 miles of highway, and they're going to repair the 10 most economically important bridges and then about 10,000 other bridges. Keep in mind, if you guys have listened or paid attention at all to the, the Society of Civil Engineers, or basically the organization that grades our infrastructure, they gave us like a C+, I think, in 2020. They're basically saying that it's going to cost $2.6 trillion to repair our infrastructure. Now, I believe they define infrastructure like how I do. And so out of $2.6 trillion that's needed, that's needed to repair our current infrastructure, they're only going to get $115 billion of that. Meanwhile, over $2 trillion is going to get sent out to all of these other places. So you can imagine, right, that if only $115 billion is allotted here, guess what we're going to get more of in a few years from now? Well, we only had $115 billion. We need more. We're going to have to print up some more money, go to the old printing press, to make more money to keep repairing our infrastructure. So I really wanted to give a kind of a detailed breakdown because I think you guys appreciate it. I find a lot of value in it. And so I wanted to break down as far as what we're expecting in this. And if you're okay with all of this, then I guess that's up to you. I know I'm not. I think it's crazy, but we're just going to keep printing money. I don't know what the long-term play here is, but I do know that I'm nervous every time we talk about trillion-dollar spending plans. But here's just another one to add to the list. Hopefully next week's show won't be on another one that they plan to do. But follow us on social media, subscribe on YouTube. I hope you guys got a lot of value. If you did, share it with a friend or share it with somebody who's not even your friend. I'm okay with that too. And we will talk to you again next week. All right, bye.